Great. I think that's knocked everyone off camera. So please accept the little message at the top if you're happy to be on camera. And yeah, I think we still have a couple of people coming in now. But I'll get started and with the introductions. So yeah, welcome to the Policy Design Community Speaker Series. We have a very exciting session today for everyone. So we're joined by Gillian and Fian, who will be giving a presentation to talk about their work on using design futures to navigate critical moments. And before we get started, I'll just pass over to Andy to give a bit of an introduction to the policy design community.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session. Thank you, Tessa, for chairing us today. This is a policy design community event. We are civil services expert community of practice for designers who particularly work at the policy end of the pipeline. And our core membership are the policy labs in government. But we have members in about 1,000 members these days across 165 public sector organisations. We're very keen to work with you. If you're not already a member, I would love you to join. I'm going to paste some details into the chat in a moment. You can either join us as an official, so if you've got a gov.uk email address, you get access to our kind of full offer, which includes events, internal and external events, newsletters, conferences, and also you get to work on exciting projects with other designers to build your practice. If you're an external person, we have lots of people come to these events who are work in private practice, or are design researchers or policy, etc. You're also very welcome to connect with us through our blog. So do subscribe to the blog. You can also subscribe to our Eventbrite page as well. So we hold these monthly public speaker events. This is one such event we're just about to go into. Next month we've got a great event coming up. It's going to be with Marco Steinberg, and that's going to be taking place on Thursday the 8th of May. So I'll paste details now into the chat, but I'll hand back to Tessa, and looking forward to today's talk.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. We are recording today's session, so if you want to come in and ask a question, you'll have to accept the recording. And the format for today is that we'll have a presentation for about 40 minutes, and you can leave any questions that may occur to you throughout in the chat, and then we can pick up on those in the Q&A at the end, and yeah, have a bit of a discussion at that point. When you do ask any questions, it would be great if you could come off camera to have a chat with the group. But yeah, over to you, Gillian and Fian.
Thank you, Tessa, and thank you, Andy, for the introductions. I'm really excited to be here and share this talk with you. This is a talk that Gillian and I have given quite a few times at this point. So hopefully none of you have seen it, and this isn't a repeat, and this is fresh face for everyone. But we will talk for the first little bit. So if you're grabbing some lunch, you've got a bit of time before you need to ask questions. You can stick questions in the chat, and if we're quick enough, we will pick them up as we're going. But otherwise, feel free to just hang on to them until towards the end. So just as a quick overview, this is a chat about a piece of work that we did just about a year ago, I guess, at this point. And with the Scottish Government, it was a collaboration between Soccer Stereo, who I worked for at the time, and then who I now work for, and the school-age childcare team at Scottish Government, who Gillian works for. And we titled the talk "Poking the Future to Design Better Policy." I think the title of the talk here was navigating critical moments, and I think that's also true. We were navigating a critical moment in the program, and that's important. But like as a rough kind of overview of what we'll talk about today. Oh, I'll share my screen. I'm looking at my own screen, thinking that I've shared it, but I'll do that now. 2 seconds. Bring back my Teams. Is that sharing for everybody?
Yeah.
Cool, great.
It is.
Excellent. Okay, so as a rough view then, we will start. Yeah, so we'll do some context and scene setting up front. Gillian will talk us through the program. I'll talk you briefly through kind of our framing of design futures and the approach that we took to the project, and then a bit through our kind of project journey. And Gillian and I will kind of hand back and forth through this before we talk about the outcomes and our kind of learnings and reflections on the project. It will take us about 40 minutes, I think. We might have sped up a little bit, but we'll see. And then we can have some questions and conversation at the end. But without further ado, my name is Fionn. I'm a partner at And Then is a small design future studio based in Glasgow, but we work across the UK. Work primarily with government and third sector, though also some private sector bits and pieces as well. This project was done with Santini, and this talk was originally done with Santini Bazar, who founded And Then, and who many of you might know. Santini is unfortunately not here today, but Gillian and I have done this before as a twosome, so we can continue with that. And Gillian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Fionn. So I'm Gillian Munro, and I work in Scottish Government on the School Age Childcare programme. And although I'm effectively the design lead for the programme, I still belong to the policy profession. So I just want to start this talk, particularly as it's been recorded, by saying that what we're going to show you, the tensions, the scenarios, and so on, they aren't settled Scottish Government policy. So they're ways of modelling the possible outcomes of the policy decisions that we make in the here and now. But if you're looking for settled Scottish Government policy on childcare, that's a different talk, and it's all published on gov.scot. So having got that part of my introduction out of the way, what is the policy that I'm the design lead for? So the policy is school age childcare, and this is our minister that you can see in the picture, who's meeting some children at a breakfast club in one of the schools that we've worked with. And so by school age childcare, we mean breakfast clubs, after school clubs, holiday clubs, childminders, but just more widely, the system of all of the care and activities that are around about the school day and in the holidays, that parents and carers can use to start work, to increase their hours, to train, and it's also that they can increase their income through employment. And we also know that these activities and access to these things is unequal at the moment, and that access to it can improve outcomes for children too. So that's really important. And these things can be regulated, childcare, like childminders or after school clubs. But we also know that parents use activity clubs like football or drama or music to extend the school day, and also friends and family as well. Around 40% of all parents will use friends and family, and it varies a little bit between holidays and term time. So there's a lot there too in that system that's about people's social capital and connectedness to community as well. So it's complex, as we will probably repeat over the course of the session. And here you go. Here's a demonstration of the complexity. Quite a lot of my policy colleagues find this slide quite triggering. This is a systems map that we did of the school age childcare system with Fionn a couple of years ago. So these childcare services and the activity services and their role in increasing income through employment, they don't exist in isolation. They're part of a big, messy ecosystem. So in communities, they exist in relation to how people travel to and from work and school, relation to relationships between schools and their local communities, how employers view childcare, how much they will support family flexibility or how much they don't support that, how many other providers are in a local area and what type, particularly thinking about the relationship between activities and regulated childcare. And that's at the community level. At a national level, we're bringing in to the system regulators like the Care Inspectorate in Scotland, SSC, who oversee qualifications for the workforce in regulated childcare, and then again wider out to the UK level. DWP and HMRC are two of the biggest sources of funding for childcare in Scotland, so they're part of the system too. So one of the things that we knew before, and we really had reinforced through our engagement with families, of which we've done a lot, is that conversations about childcare are really deeply personal. They get right to the heart of the very tough decisions that families make about family, identity, finances. Everyone's got lived experience of being cared for or not, or of caring for their families, and most people want to talk about it, so it's not unusual for me to go into a meeting to talk about data standards and leave just having talked about somebody's childcare issues for the entire meeting. And it's really difficult to talk about childcare without talking about the tensions that hold the system together in equilibrium, and that's what everybody wants to do. So it's one of the things that we addressed head on with this project. So into this big, messy, complex ecosystem, Scottish Government have dropped a school-age childcare programme. So it's been running since 2022, and this is one half of our plan on the page for it. So really important to note, you see why are we doing it, that it's a Tackling Child Poverty programme. Tackling Child Poverty is one of Scottish Government's 4 key missions, and in fact this programme contributes to 3 of them. Really important that we are considering child poverty, and those are the 6 priority family types that we have in the Tackling Child Poverty space in Scottish Government, so it's very much focused on those families. And for the purposes of this talk, that how will we do it is really important. Social policy is hugely complex, and we think that the best way to understand complex systems is through the lived experience of the people who are in those systems. So it's really important that the programme as a whole is taking a people-centred approach to this. And you should see evidence of that through this talk. And also we're taking a place-based approach to it. So as well as the kind of research and engagement that we will describe having synthesised over the course of this talk, School Age Childcare Programme also funds delivery of childcare in communities too. We do it in a few different ways. One is through 6 early adopter communities, which are run by local authorities and are looking at community level systems of childcare and what it takes to take that place-based approach, looking at what's important to communities, and we'll come back and mention those later. But we also have a funded programme through the Scottish Football Association that is collaborating with 31 football trusts to deliver activities around about the school day too. So that delivery aspect of the programme is really important as well. So this Futures project came at a time when we had 2 years of this delivery and the learning and the engagement behind us from the programme, and we were looking at our resource context and our funding context and our political context, and we needed to support ministers to consider what next. And there was this really specific thread through as well. We'd done a discovery into payment mechanisms for childcare in Scotland. And that had given us the push to really think about, as well as the childcare services and communities themselves, the invisible service that existed in the childcare system, which was about finding, managing and paying for childcare and how providers support that. That in itself, we were finding from our engagement with parents and carers, was a barrier to people wanting to take up stable employment. It's particularly difficult for school-aged children when each family is probably managing a jigsaw of different providers. So we wanted to take this moment to make that invisible service more tangible, and see it in relation to other bits of the system, and to get some alignment between some of those different services before we launched into prototyping an end-to-end service for that find, manage and pay. And I think that was one of the things that I wanted to touch on a little bit here, was that we're already talking about kind of experience of bringing some skills and expertise to do with design into the policy making space before we then pushed into what could be a future asked to be doing service design for a future service. And some of that was about having some design capability within the policy team, but also about knowing what to ask for. And knowing what to ask for, I think, leads us on to Fion's next slide.
Do you want me to, sorry, I can't remember. I thought this was you finishing up, but I can talk about this. Sorry.
No,
so
I can do it. I'll take it back. So not Fion's next slide, my next slide. You can tell there's a gap where Santini should be at the moment. So it was really about bringing together the policy expertise that we had in the Scottish Government programme, and the subject matter expertise about childcare, but also probably just enough policy design capability, as I say, to know what we were asking for. Bringing in, at the time, it was Sopra Steria that had that the dedicated user-centered design skills, but they also had background project knowledge too, from having worked with us on the systems mapping and on the discovery project for the payment mechanisms too. And then we added in for this particular piece of work that very specific design futures expertise from And Then in a particular moment in time where we wanted to use that design futures approach to help us move forward in the policy making.
Thanks, Gillian. And then I guess when we really think about that design futures aspect of this, and when we kind of situate the approach of how we went around this project, I guess it was really about understanding, given the kind of complexity of this space, and given the vision that we're holding for the future of school-aged childcare in Scotland, I think design futures felt like a really important tool to use. So if you think about future studies, like traditional futures, as a way of kind of systematically thinking about the future, kind of opening up the policy or the possibilities of what the future might hold, and maybe demystifying that using tools like trend forecasting or scenario building or world building to help us understand what potential things might happen in the future. Design futures really then helps to kind of recognize where those kind of difficulties are in holding that sense of the future or possible futures in your mind, and kind of recognizing that sometimes they can feel quite abstract or maybe difficult to connect with, and they're very often very kind of dependent on people's individual expertise or knowledge. And so we kind of bring, or using design features as a way of kind of making that more experiential and making it more participatory across the program. In particular, one of the key methods that we used in this program was Prototype, which is a provocative prototype. It's not a typo. And it's a tool to really, I guess, amplify and provoke discussion and agree what the future should hold. So sometimes I think we can kind of take a scenario that might feel quite familiar. It's a design fiction tool. So you might take an archetype of something, for instance, an ad or a letter that you might receive in the post, but just change the context slightly to describe a future scenario, or to describe a way that a future scenario might come to life, and that become entry points into kind of these quite intangible topics often that become more, they place you within this context more. They may move you from a point of being an observer of the future to being a protagonist within the future, and that kind of change helps you to connect with that more I guess just more helps you to connect with that kind of feature more and make a different decision around it. So this was the tool that we were going to use through this, and often these are intentionally controversial in order to kind of receive the right type of feedback that we need to. But the broad objectives of the project were, one, to bring that existing vision to life. So Gillian showed you the vision of the school age childcare program, and so what really want to add detail to that, to kind of make clear what it might mean in practice, and use that as a way to accelerate that alignment around the program. And that alignment being like a core aspect. So how can you create conversation and dialogue with colleagues that then brings a shared understanding, a shared vocabulary, a shared way of discussing the future in a different way? And then finally, can we create tools and artifacts that help them communicate that? So as we've come through this program and through a project, create a series of artifacts that then can be used again and again to kind of translate to people who are outside the program or within the program, what the kind of visions of that future might hold. And just as a quick note of engagement, you know, the program is place-based, it is user-centered and person-centered. This piece of work was very internally focused. This was a kind of convergent point of the program. A lot of work had been done previously to engage the communities in lots of different ways, through discoveries, through the Test of Change work that Gillian talked about, through the Children's Charter. There's many different activities that had already happened in this kind of divergent opening up the conversation. And this is really focused on internally aligning around this, what they understand the program to hold, and synthesizing existing knowledge. So just as there is a context that you might be saying, why didn't you engage this wider? But this was very kind of short and focused piece of engagement. So the project had, I think it was about 10 weeks, and we had 3 kind of distinct phases in this piece of work. So the first was really about understanding the context and immersing ourselves in the program, understanding what perhaps had changed in that program. Then we had this central part, which was really around building these prototypes. But in order to build the prototypes, you kind of have to do some building of worlds to help you situate those prototypes and think about what they might hold. And then finally, kind of translating those reactions, I'll discuss that properly in a few minutes, or translating these kind of things into the conversations, into visions of the future that we could use as communication artifacts. So first, then I'll talk about that understanding of the context. So I think, like any project that we all do, and especially from a design perspective, but I think anybody doing a project starts with this kind of background immersion, right? You understand the project by engaging with project materials or kind of written things around it, and then you understand it through speaking with the people connected to the project, speaking with stakeholders. So we did both of those things, like going back over old research reports, going back over kind of strategy directions and strategy papers, looking at different kind of changes in the program that had been structured, but also then speaking to the stakeholders within the program and some kind of programs that were adjacent to that. So as we had stepped between phases of projects, you know, a program for government had been named, the scope of the school age childcare was potentially opening, and so we were engaging other programs as part of that to understand how that might shift. But through this, really, what we were starting to do is identify tensions. And so rather than kind of summarize our analysis as a series of themes or a series of kind of things that were bubbling up, what we defined these themes were as tensions, and that's where our focus went to. And really, when we talked about tensions, we were talking about like something that felt really important to the program. It might be around like the key mission or the key objective of the program, but that was maybe described vaguely or understood differently across different people, and sometimes that was often opposing, and they were imposing positions that people in the program felt about the policy direction. And I think this wasn't in the case, but you could see that if these things kept going, they would become impasses. They would become points where they would stop the team from progressing. So these tensions became the nubs of the things that we would focus on. But an example of the tension that was coming out was government's role, and what role should government be playing in childcare. And so just as we started the program and we talked about navigating critical moments, one of the critical moments was a change in how some of the program remit and some of the program structure. And so there was a conversation that was emerging about what role Scottish government should be playing in childcare. Should it be like providing funding, or should it be doing stuff to kind of bridge different parts of the system together? Another question that was coming up was, should the government be focused on putting out fires in the existing system because there's lots of challenges already in the existing, or should it be just seeking to rebuild from the ground up? How can we kind of balance these two pressures for immediate reform that would provide immediate relief for certain people, but maybe in a short-term view, versus kind of fixing more long-term systemic issues? So they were the kind of tensions that we got, and we use those as kind of ways of thinking, okay, well, they're the kind of key points that we need to have conversations around. But really what then we need to do is move into a space where we provoke those conversations and build these prototypes. But it wasn't quite a straight line between these tensions and these prototypes. There was a kind of connection that needed to happen between the two. And I guess one of the key things that we needed to do within these prototypes was, with talking about government's role, it's very hard to go, okay, well, like a key thing that we need to get people to do is step into that world of thinking about what government's role is. That kind of cognitive disconnect between that tension and an experience where you feel connected to government's role is really hard to just do straight off the bat. So what we did do is start expanding those tensions into worlds and imagining what worlds might exist if you were to amplify some of these tensions. So what world might exist, for instance, if government's role was, we use the analogies of what if government was like a garden or government was like a machine, which I think is an analogy that people might already be familiar with. Or what role might government have if it completely kind of, I guess, moves into a free market space and kind of abdicates some of that responsibility and puts it onto the private sector to deliver a childcare system. Like what kind of roles might emerge in these spaces, and use those then to identify moments that then we could kind of consider, oh, that would be an interesting prototype moment. And that was kind of our way of doing it. So we mapped our worlds, identified those moments, and then a little bit of robustness, checked that we had everybody covered off in terms of our actors and user groups across the program, and connected back to all our tensions. And these then translated into these moments, which we were describing as prototypes. So these were things like, what would it mean if childcare looks very different in different areas? If in inner city Glasgow, it's a scrumpled form that you get back in your bag and you have to pay a fiver for a lunch, and it's a WhatsApp group in Islands and Islands where a parent is supporting, people are taking people to the beach, and then in a more affluent area, it's a very flash website and children are learning about AI and going on skiing holidays. But all of them use Scottish Government funding. What would that mean? Or what would it mean if people who were able to navigate the system were able to receive funded support more than people who actually needed it, and maybe it was getting the wrong people? Or what would it mean if childcare was treated as a convenience service and a commodity, something that people could monetize and kind of do as a kind of gig economy, an Uber-fied childcare experience, if you like? Or what would it mean if our decision making around policy and around the things that we were doing were driven purely by economic lenses? So they were an example of the prototypes that we were building and the kind of way that we got to these prototypes. But they weren't the end goal. Really, these were just an engagement tool, and they were a way to help people connect to that feature and help us understand how people want to respond or how people were responding to that feature, so that then we kind of translate that into the next step. So I'll hand back to Gillian and she can talk us through how we did that.
So this is the point in the process where I kind of ran round the back and went from commissioner of this process to participant in the workshops, and we did it over the space of a week. There was a flow of workshops, and we grouped people slightly differently. This is a workshop from the first day where we had a much smaller group of people and presented them with the prototypes, allowed the discussions to play out, and did some clustering of reactions and some breakout discussions, and then ended with postcards to the future. And what was really important about that workshop was that the people that were in workshop 1 were then held responsibility for those prototypes and took them into workshop 2, which was much broader. And this one involved everybody in the school age childcare programme, the whole breadth of colleagues, and there are about 30 of us that work on the programme, together with our colleagues from our division for that looks at childcare for younger children as well. So very wide and very similar presentation of prototypes, and then response back. Really good discussions, and again we used those postcards to the future, and that they acted as like mini summaries of people's individual reflections and their experiences, the conversations that they had through the workshops, and they captured a lot of the sub themes that had been spoken about, as well as the artifacts that we were left with in the rooms and on the walls, and so on too. So there was a real range of outputs from those workshops, including a lot of people who had quite a lot to think about. So the prototypes really were quite provocative, and really helped us to delve into some of the things that we'd been saying, and almost it's quite easy to say. So I said at the beginning of the talk that we are place-based. The programme is place-based, and then really thinking through some of the implications of, so what does it mean then if childcare does look vastly different in different areas, and to what extent, you know, as policymakers, are we comfortable with presenting options to ministers that look very, very different in different parts of Scotland? And how do we then tell the story of what difference does this make for everybody in Scotland? So really those prototypes really helped us to get into those discussions too. Really important discussions about who is this for. Again, we have the 6 priority family types for tackling poverty, but really important to be thinking about who is it, who is these childcare offers or these childcare changes really for. And that was particularly in the next slide. The spreadsheet of we're learning quite a lot about different cohorts of people, families where the parents are much closer to the labour market than others, and then obviously thinking about, well, it would potentially be more cost effective to do work to move those families that are closest to the labour market into the labour market, but what does that mean for tackling child poverty and who benefits? So that spreadsheet one and the one before really helped to surface some of those conversations too. And there was the moment where we still remember our programme manager looked at that spreadsheet and said, "Where did you get these figures from?" They were completely made up, but it's good that it's got that reaction from you. And the one that always gets the strongest reaction from me, and this is one of the first times that I've been able to look at this without putting my head in my hands, is the Uber for childcare. And we've been talking about that find, manage and pay service and making that as easy as possible, but how far are we prepared to remove the friction of accessing childcare for families, and what does that look like if we really push it to its extreme, and how comfortable would we be with putting options like that to ministers?
And I should say, just in terms of how these are presented, obviously we've got these on the screen, but so for some of the spreadsheet, I think that was just a print off of the spreadsheet with a sticky tab on it. And I guess I guess if you can imagine some of the way that the workshop was structured, it was maybe nearly like a group usability test in some ways. It was a presenting of one of these things in a way that felt familiar, and then a kind of a way for people and waiting for people to respond and see where they went with, which was quite interesting to see how different people would respond and different groups as well. But one of the key things through those workshops was really to get to these 2 and 10-year visions. Was kind of, you've kind of come through the arc of this. Okay, we've presented you with this thing, and it's been, people are kind of reeling from some of that, and then they're thinking through what it meant, and they've done some theming and thinking, and now at the end we've got them to summarize their individual aspirations or individual thinking in these workshops or in these postcards. And the first group we had, I think, was a 10-year outlook, and then the second group we had was a 2-year outlook. And I guess that 10 years, that is far enough away that it's it might have seen 2 government cycles, but that 2-year was very much like what happens by the next parliamentary cycle. So in a way, we had kind of designed this frame, and like from thinking about from our side, from Anden's side, we had designed this frame of how this would work, and came to the end where we had these kind of statements, and they were like, okay, cool, these are like really clear communication of where the program is going and where what the vision of the program is, and in more tangible ways. And this becomes the communication tool. This becomes how we communicate. And Gillian and Kate, Gillian's colleague, very quickly were like, oh, just remember our user-centered, place-based, person-centered element of the program. As we had a quick, oh yes, yeah, you completely. We're back into government speak and ways of talking about this program and communicating the future that was very much rooted in, I guess, quite conceptual ways. So then we pivoted towards kind of creating these vignettes of the future, I guess, which were ways of just describing the future where we looked at different parts of the story. We looked at what the vision statements were saying. We took some of the details from the different user groups that the school-age childcare program had defined. We looked at different service moments within those. We tried to come up with, things that might be, within a childcare setting, or it might be about paying, or it might be about finding childcare, it might be about these early adopter communities. And then we kind of layered in things around the design principles that the program had come up with, the user needs that they'd identified, and some other strategic messages. And that combination of elements then spat out a kind of story about the future. And that came into these kind of ways of individual stories that then were connected more broadly. So we had a large landscape that described a world that this future was working towards, but then these kind of individual small moments. And this like this at the end. So we have these 7 stories or 7 vignettes, which on this landscape are connected. And these statements reflect kind of broad changes that could happen in 2 years. And on the right-hand side, then you have how those changes might evolve in 10 years. And I'll keep that as could and might, because as Gillian mentioned, these are not agreed to Scottish policy for what we're working towards. And then we had these kind of more granular moments of like what this might mean for an individual person. So for instance, this story was about Ailey working in healthcare and having quite an unpredictable childcare pattern, or shift pattern, sorry, and therefore a childcare pattern. But actually, because changes in government regulation could broaden the scope for how different funded providers worked, then a community hub could start offering childcare. And in that as well, Ailey had a child with a disability, and reassurance and quality frameworks that came from the policy could help reassure parents that their children could access the right level of care. And therefore, these kind of things going hand in hand would mean that Ailey's able to take more shifts, has funded childcare in place to be able to do work, and therefore able to improve the outcomes for her children. For instance, saving for a camping trip and taking taking their children on holidays, and also getting some rest. So all of these things which kind of combine together in something more tangible. And Gillian, do you want to talk about the second one?
I will, yes. So I think you probably get the idea of what we're doing with these vignettes, so I don't want to dwell on this too much, but some of these, and I can see, Brian, you've put a comment in the chat about kind of alternative futures and so on. Some of what we were trying to get to with this vignette was about what difference would it make for Yomi if we're changing the concept of what childcare is and how existing government supports can be used to pay for it, and I suppose pushing at some wider alternative futures, which is how that you can see the fence around childcare is getting expanded to include more different types of activities and so on, but really focusing in on what difference that would make for this particular family and this particular person. So bringing it back to things that are potentially quite dry regulatory changes, but bringing them down into what difference that could make in a people-centered way to particular families and communities. So I think one of the, sorry, go on.
No, go for it. I was just going to remind you what it was.
Yeah, and how they all fit together. So it's really important that they all fit together in this wider landscape. And the reason why it's important that they all fit together is that it was important for us to express how they fit together. So you can see that the little blue figures that are in there that are saltire blue represent the role of Scottish Government in making these changes and in the landscape too. And we've picked out to zoom in on one of those particular parts of the slide there. So this is very much envisaging Scottish Government as having a connecting role. Again, one of the things that I think about quite a lot is some of the work that came out of Policy Lab quite a few years ago now about different styles of government intervention, and we were being quite intentional about our role as conveners and connectors, and that commissioning role that we have as well in the school age childcare system too. So it was a really important part of this landscape and the whole concept that we were pulling together. So what's happened since? What difference did it make? So we've put these outputs into ministerial submissions. We've taken them to our programme board. We have used them in face-to-face ministerial meetings and so on. And particularly in that regulatory space, they've been really, really effective in terms of being able to show what difference regulatory change could potentially mean. We've used them as well to help us prioritise what's possible with the resources that we have, and we've used it to make sure that as we restructured the programme slightly, that we've brought together things like the work that we do on the activities funding with the work that we do on looking at possibilities for regulatory change. And so how we've aligned the programme around some of these vignettes has been really important too. Using it as a part of my day job, I'm also the lead for the early adopter communities. So we're using it to tell the story of how 6 tests of change can inform a wider programme of work that will make a difference across Scotland. And then one that's quite unexpected was that we still use it a lot in those day-to-day conversations that we have amongst colleagues, and when we're considering about how we interact with ministers, about those tensions in a more intentional way and accepting them and being able to name them and have really productive conversations about them. And so what have we learned? I would say that it's made it very clear what the role is about design and thinking about systems and policy, and particularly when you're looking at complex change and social policy. particularly visualizing these very kind of like dry and perhaps quite intangible concepts. So that's number one. Number two.
I think very tightly connected is the power of making. I think sometimes, you know, we can kind of get quite heady in some of these spaces, but actually bringing something to life can really help progress conversations, because people can locate it tangibly and think through it, and that changes the nature of the conversation that's being had.
It does, and I think that you pointed out, Fionn, about having physical printed out artifacts that we were moving around and what have you. The actual literally tangible was really, really, really important to trigger a different way of thinking. One of the ways that I've explained this as well, particularly when I present that landscape map to people who say, oh, so this is what Scottish Government has committed to do over the next 2 years, and we have to say, no, it's not a settled policy. It's we're describing it as it's a type of modelling. So as policymakers, we're very often used to working with economists or operational researchers to model, to change the inputs or to change the processes that that we might be supporting with policy, and modelling what the effect of that might be. And we're using this very much in a very similar way of we're modelling the decisions that we might ask for in this complex social policy space, and thinking about what the outcomes for those decisions might be in communities for people too.
Cool. And the last one, I think, was about, you know, actually one of the key things that happened through this project. It was quite emergent. I said we had a very clear structure when we started the project, but for instance, the focus on tensions was not something that we'd initially focused on. We thought that what we would do is immerse ourselves in the context, then we would speak with Gillian and Kate and a few others from the programme and define a set of areas that we would then provoke conversations into. But then those tensions really started to emerge, and that became the kind of point at which we kind of talked about, and we were able to document them and pass them over. And so I think through this we had this kind of moment of adapting and changing to the circumstances, and I think that was really a good practice to be able to make sure that we could reflect and respond to the needs of the program at the time, and also had the trust within the team and across the relationship to be able to do that. So that's us. I'm conscious we're slightly over, so I'll give time back for questions and stuff. I can't see any questions yet because I'm sharing my screen, but I'll stop doing that.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation. I think we had a couple of reflections popping up in the chat on the concept of the Uber Care model and the idea of a prototype. I think we have a question now from Laura. Laura, do you want to come in and ask your question?
Camera picks up. Thank you for that. That was really fantastic. I was the person talking about the Uber Care model. I think that's just coming from a different internal value system. But I was interested in whether there were any things that had been removed from the system. And what I'm reflecting there is about the human kind of predilection towards adding things, our addition bias, which could further increase your complexity, and may not always be the best solution for an outcome. So I was just interested in, did you identify anything through the work to kind of remove from the system to get your outcomes, but may not have been quite the focus?
That's a good question. Yeah, because there was definitely additive ones. Like, you know, we were talking about, I think one of the worlds that we were imagining was like this very, I guess, probably a government as a machine, which is maybe like a government that we maybe can recognize, and all the additions that might come with that, like intrusions into privacy, additional forms, additional bureaucracy, building layer upon layer of things that you would have to navigate through, and how complicated that would be. But I'm not sure. Did we think about like what the effect of removing things would be? I'm not sure.
So I suppose the vignette that I shared and again, this is where I begin to talk a little bit more slowly, because this is not settled Scottish Government policy, is some of the things about removing the barriers between the regulated sector that we have and the activities, that the much more activities focused sector, and what the effects of that could be, particularly in terms of unlocking the use of UK government benefits, but also potentially equalising the relationship between those different types of providers and so on too. That's probably the closest that we've got to that, but we're really just in very exploratory phases about what would even be possible there. But yes, it is something to consider, and it's much harder to take things away than it is to add them, which is why I started to speak very slowly and barely even want to mention it. So good question, Laura.
No, thank you. I work at an intersection, so I'm DEFRA, but I also work with a not-for-profit and on my local parish council. So I see these at like lots of different scales, and quite often for me, I'm trying to just smooth things out. So yeah, thank you very much for answering that.
No problem. Well, I do, like, you know, we did talk, and I'll use this term very lightly, but about deregulation. I think we didn't mean it in deregulation. I think we meant it in re-regulation, which would be what would happen if you have to change the regulations, and rather than just layer regulations upon each other, how could you change it so that it works more effectively? Any other questions? I'm just going to try and go through the chat.
There are.
Oh, we've got to. Jack.
Oh, cool shotgun. Sorry. Thank you very much for a great presentation. I particularly love the point around the power of making. Kind of design as an emergent practice to provoke lots of different perspectives. I think the argument of using internal stakeholders, because you've already got that kind of really great grounding, and it looks like you did some really great research, and I quickly watched that video on Silent, and it looks incredible, was really well, like really logical. I guess my question is, do you think the prototyping on the approach would change dramatically with the inclusion of citizens in that process? And do you think some of the friction would be a bit worse because of the policymakers would then have to engage with citizens directly? I guess kind of what added tensions do you reckon that would add to the mix?
If we took the prototypes out to community centres and put them in front of parents and carers, and so on. We considered this, didn't we, Fionn?
Yeah.
In the Scottish Government has a National Advisory Council for Women and Girls, and my team has just done some engagement with the Lived Experience panel that supports that. And we were thinking about what we could do to use these prototypes in that engagement with with that Lived Experience panel for the women there too. And in the end, we went for a different approach. We actually used legislative theatre to engage with the panel, and that was because of the particular makeup of the people in the panel. But we're definitely thinking about it, and I'm always conscious that we have them there as a resource that we can be using to engage with parents and carers and providers. So it's definitely a tool that I consider to be in my box when we're going out and doing that engagement, and we absolutely would.
I think it was primarily to do with, you know, some of these things are like project scope stuff, like how much time do we have, how much budget do we have, like how much capacity could we, you know, how long would it take us to engage? And so, you know, there was absolutely that conversation, Jack, right at the beginning of like, it'd be great to do this with a broader group of people, but just due to some constraints, it felt like they're not the right time. And also the focus was really about how can we make sure the program was quite clear. I think, and we didn't really talk about this, but the program was at a point of having some kind of changes in I guess, remit, and had to really reconsider how it was focused and what the structure of the team might look like. So it felt more like a higher priority to focus on that group at the time. And I think actually, just to speak to Brian M's conversation within that, I think again, we didn't bring in a broader set of features. Like, I guess the alternative features that we were providing were the things that kind of meant, well, if we take these tensions and we amplify them as a future, and we think about that world in the future. They were the alternative futures that were coming through, but we didn't bring in any like trend analysis or horizon scanning to support that. We were focused primarily on what had already been done and getting alignment around that, because that was the kind of the scope of the work that was packaged.
Thank you very much.
Vicky, you've put a question in too. Do you want me to pick it straight up from the chat?
Yeah, you can do. Sorry, if I misheard or misunderstood, then please ignore. But I think you'd said a bit about ownership and getting people to take ownership of some of the stuff out of the back of some of the workshops that you did. So just interested if you got any tips on how you did that.
They didn't get a lot of choice, did they, Fionn, actually, in retrospect?
Yeah, I guess the ownership was we had facilitated the first round, and you know, for designers and researchers in the audience, you'll kind of be familiar with this kind of like presenting something, but like then just allowing a response to that, and kind of working with that, and kind of being in that research position of trying to respond. And so in the second workshop, then we flipped it so that those policymakers that have been in that first session and had been those people responding then became the researchers in the second session and owned it in that sense of you know, presenting these amplified ideas and seeing how people responded and capturing that. So yeah, it wasn't so much, I don't know if we got them to buy in as much as we forced it upon them, that they would be playing that role in the workshop.
But they were very carefully selected of like who was responding most and who was likely to take the most ownership of them too. So yeah, it was, and they did. It really worked. Definitely. Can I just take that one kind of like final question from Brian of like, this work is a futures project. Is this a one-off or a change in practice of policy making? Well, thank you for asking that. Number one, I've only got one policy that I work on, which is the school-age childcare policy. So a project like this, we would do something like this again in the future if we needed to, but we don't need to keep doing things like this at the minute. We do participate in some of the horizon scanning work, which is slightly different, but I just have that. We just have that one policy that we're working on, but we are thinking in terms of practice. We are thinking about what do we do next, and what do we do to keep bringing design into policy making. And our current challenge is how do we use the evidence that we're getting from the delivery and use design processes in order to be able to get us from that delivery evidence to recommendations and through to some ministerial decisions about the future of the programme. So we're looking for some support with that too. So if that sounds like it's something that's interesting to you, then do drop me a message about it. But this particular project we wouldn't do again unless we needed to. But continuing to think about what is the role of design in policy making, absolutely.
Thanks so much, everyone, for all of your questions, and thanks again, Gillian and Fionn, for sharing your work with us, and for everyone for joining. Andrew has pasted a link in the chat with some more info on joining the policy design community and some of our upcoming events, so please check that out if you're interested. And yeah, thanks again so much for the presentation today, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you very much.
Speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks.